30 Years a Watchtower Slave, Chapter 16, entitled Action in New Jersey. And the first subheading is Truly a Slave. He mentions, "Now I know that I was held captive or enslaved because he failed to study God's Word by itself without the distortion of Watchtower helps. When in 1943 I finally began to awaken to that fact, he didn't become fully free until 11 years later in 1954. And that would make 30 years after he first entered slavery on August 18th, 1924, into the Watchtower Bethel of Magdeburg, Germany. He said that he paid dearly in every way for his independence, especially enduring mental torture and torment. After having done these things in obedience to the organizational instructions, deep remorse would enter his soul and sadness would fill his mind. But when the next instructions came along, he followed instructions without hesitation, just like a regular zombie." The next subheading is entitled On the Boardwalk. So when he received his next assignment to go to Atlantic City, New Jersey, in the summer of 1938, he went willingly. And he was sent with the express purpose of creating an issue. That issue was that he was to create a grandstand during that summer on the famous Boardwalk of Atlantic City. Some background information. Mayor White had permitted the Salvation Army to use the Boardwalk to take collections. This gave the witnesses an opportunity. Without requesting for a permit, the witnesses began to preach there, and they were warned to desist. But when they continued, guess what? They were arrested. So when the witnesses finally did apply for their permits, the mayor refused upon the ground that their work was different from that of the Salvation Army. The mayor explained that the Salvation Army was accepted everywhere as a charitable organization and that not one of the guests of Atlantic City would take offense to their appearance on the boardwalk. The mayor politely pointed out that the same could not be said about the witnesses, because after all, they had just came out of a 5-year campaign throughout New Jersey in which hundreds of them had been arrested and convicted. The mayor felt that the appearance of the witnesses would create friction, so he turned them down. The society now stepped in to make an issue of this, which was the very thing the mayor did not want and tried to avoid. So the plan was to have a day-long witnessing campaign throughout Atlantic City to be culminated by a meeting held in defiance of the mayor's edict that they could not have a permit to preach there on the boardwalk. And the author was selected to be the fall guy. In other words, he was to give the talk that evening. He mentions that he had been arrested many times before in the name of Watchtower causes, approximately 16 times to be exact, both in Germany and in the United States. He faced mobs before. He said that he had been stoned twice and one time practically hit over the head with a heavy oak chair. So while he didn't like this prospect, he felt that was the price he had to pay. The next subheading is entitled, To Jail We Go. So the day-long witnessing campaign in Atlantic City culminated, and promptly 7 o'clock came. A huge crowd of 25,000 gathered on the boardwalk. When two plainclothes officers came up to him and asked him to step down and said, "You are under arrest." Well, this was the signal for the publishers to go through the crowd and leave pamphlets with the people giving them the Watchtower version of the reason for this arrest. And of course, the publishers carried this instruction out faithfully, and 17 others were arrested. So this created a real splash. He mentions that he was ashamed that night for being arrested as a common violator of the law in a city in which he was a stranger, actually. He didn't even live there. He was taken to jail and fingerprinted, and 2 reporters were there and were allowed to talk to him. It seems that the mayor of Atlantic City wasn't in favor with the press. So, of course, they jumped on the witnesses' side of the story, and it made big headlines in the newspapers the next day. The next subheading is entitled Troublous Thoughts. So here he was, supposedly a Christian, and he was picking a fight just like a common political agitator would, picking a fight with people he had never seen and against whom he had absolutely nothing against. He was miserable, and he felt like he was the worst kind of creature. And check this out. While he was in jail, arrested, they picked up a guy who had been drunk the night before, and he came up to the author and he asked, "What are you in here for, buddy?" The author says, "For preaching the gospel." The drunk man looked him up and down with utter contempt, and with a frown on his face, he said, "They would hardly do that," and walked away. The manner in which he said this, he could see that this drunk guy knew that he was lying. The author mentions that in his heart he knew he was right. He knew that the man, this drunk man, was right. He didn't come to preach the gospel, but he came to create an issue for his theocratic masters. The next subheading is entitled Rewarded. So he was welcomed back to Brooklyn Bethel as a hero. So they assigned him a choice chunk of theocratic territory in 1938. And that was a territory of northeastern Ohio and northeastern Pennsylvania. So he was thoroughly briefed on his assignment, but it wasn't going to be all peaceful times, none of that. His assignment was to raise several issues there in Ohio and push them through to the Supreme Court. Now he understood why he had been tested in Atlantic City. The Watchtower Society knew that he would follow through. In fact, one of the Bethelites put it into words when he said, "You are tough enough to do it." So, in accepting this assignment, he once again became the hatchet man for the Watchtower Society. He was to cause trouble for himself, out of which he would not be able to take himself out of the Watchtower and escape for 16 more years. In the years immediately ahead, witnesses on whose toes I had stepped were to take a frightful vengeance of me, a vengeance which I justly deserved. This is going to end this chapter. Please stay tuned for the next. Thank you for taking time to watch and listen to this presentation. Post your comments, like and share this video, subscribe to my channel, and stay tuned for the next chapter.